I too want to join in expressing appreciation for the visitors that are present, accepting the invitation of whoever asked you to come. But I don't want to overlook the members of this congregation who have so faithfully came night after night, and even in the daytime class studies, to participate in this effort at reviewing and learning more about the holy will of God that will help us serve the Savior that we've been singing about. It's been a pleasure for me to enjoy the renewing of friendship with Jim and Nita. They've been gracious in their hospitality. We met one another way back in the 70s and somehow continue to put up with one another all these years. It's been a real pleasure. They've been so gracious to us, and we thank them for that. And so many of you have been kind to provide meals for us, and the food is good, but even better is the company. Getting to visit with people on a one-on-one basis and get to know you better heightens the beauty of our relationship, and I want to thank each and every one of you for that. You've had some very kind and encouraging comments. You may have had some others that I didn't hear, but anyway, I appreciate the kind and encouraging comments that I did hear. And we're here to study and learn together. If you do have some comments about the lessons that you think that I may not want to hear but need to hear, that's okay. You can email me or text me, and I'll be glad to consider those. I'm not saying I'll have the answer to the questions you may pose, but that's always a good exercise for me to have the things that I say tested. So you'd be welcome to do that. I want to express my appreciation for not only the attendance, but the attention that's been given as we've presented these lessons, and I encourage your attention tonight to the study that we'll be engaged in. We're going to begin our lesson with a passage you know so well you don't even have to turn there. It's in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. It's in the 10 Commandments that was given the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. Honor your father and mother. That was given to the nation of Israel about 1,500 years before Christ came to the earth. We're not in the nation of Israel, not religiously. You may have Jewish lineage, but there is no nation of Israel like that nation today. So why would we be interested in a law that was given to a nation actually that no longer exists, and a law that came to an end about 1,500 years later? When you get over to the New Testament, however, in the book of Ephesians, in a letter written to a church in the New Testament period, you find this same command repeated. Honor your father and mother. And here it is, 1,500 years later, Paul writes to a church and tells the people there to honor your father and mother. Why, if it was under the Old Testament law, and we're not under the Old Testament law, does he tell Christians to honor their father and mother? Here's the reason. It's not a Christian duty. If you've been here throughout the week, you know what I'm talking about. It is the duty of Christians, but not because they're Christians. Obviously, if you don't have a father and mother any longer, you can't obey that command. That duty is based on the relationship you sustain to a father and mother. It also tells you which man and which woman you are to honor, the one you sustain that relationship to. And so although the command in Exodus 20 was to the nation of Israel, it was a duty based not upon the fact that they could trace their lineage to Abraham, but because they had a father and a mother. And the same is true today. Every man, every woman, every boy, every girl, wherever they live, whatever language they speak, whatever religion they may profess, have the responsibility to honor their father and mother. You young people in this audience, you have the responsibility to honor your father and mother. We're going to be talking a little bit about what that entails today. It's interesting in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. In 1 Timothy, Paul is writing to the young preacher in Ephesus. And in this particular chapter, he's talking to this preacher about what he's to teach the church about widows. Some very interesting things. But I want you to note that he says in verse 3 that if a widow has children or grandchildren, they must learn first to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now when you get to verse 8, there's an interesting statement. In verse 8 he says, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. You remember we said things can be written to Christians that are not Christian duties, that it is not based on being a Christian. This underscores that. Here he said there's an unbeliever who understands this responsibility. He may not believe in Jesus Christ, but an unbeliever can understand the responsibility to provide for, to care for his mother and father. And Paul is telling Timothy to teach that church. You live under the blazing light of Christianity, and you don't take care of your mother and daddy? Shame on you. You're worse than an unbeliever. Even an unbeliever understands that duty based, not on being a Christian, but based on the relationship you sustain to either parents or grandparents. Being a Christian makes that duty more emphatic because Christ expects us to fulfill those duties that grow out of these various relationships that we had. Now, when it says honor your father and mother, what our first thought is, well, that's our biological father and mother, the ones that gave us life. Well, it certainly includes that. But is it limited to that? Let's suppose, and some of you in this audience may have this very relationship. Let's suppose either your biological father or mother passed away, or they were delinquent in their responsibilities from the time you were a youth. And so now you had a stepfather or a stepmother. Honor your father and mother. You say, but they're not my biological parents. They didn't give me life. It's interesting as you go through the Bible that words, we've talked about this, haven't we? Words have various meanings. It's like a bus that's traveling with different passengers. And while father and mother can carry the idea of biological connection, we see that the word father is often used to connote other ideas that are often associated with what is the expected duty of a father. Let me illustrate some of these. Look over in Genesis chapter 45. Genesis chapter 45 and verse 8. This is about Joseph. And look at his statement. Genesis 45 and verse 8. If you're familiar with the story of Joseph, you know that God used him providentially to save not only the Egyptians, but Jacob and his sons. But note verse 8. He said to his brothers, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh. What? This young boy who's now probably in late 30s, he's been made a father to Pharaoh, not biologically. The idea here of father is the idea of provision, care. He put him in a position and gave him the wisdom to be able to provide for the 7 years of famine. And he says, he's made me a father to Pharaoh to provide for the nation of Egypt and also for Jacob and his sons. Look at Job chapter 29. And you'll see the same idea in the book of Job chapter 29. Now, if you were with us in our lesson on Sunday morning in the Bible class, we read Job 31, where Job testifies to his moral integrity. Back up a chapter 2 to chapter 29, you have something very similar to what we read in chapter 31. In chapter 29, note in verse 16, I was father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. What do you mean, a father to the needy? Over in chapter 31, when he talked about that, you'll see he said, I've kept the poor from their desire, if I've kept the poor from their desire, verse 16, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, etc. And talked about the orphan and how he cared for the orphan. And then in verse 19, he said, if anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy has no covering. But now in chapter 29, he describes doing those things, providing those needs as a father. In other words, the idea of a father is more than having a boy, being able to produce the seed that produces a child. It's providing for. That's carried in the word father as you read about it in the Bible. Now note over in Psalm chapter 68. Psalm chapter 68 and verse 5, you see another related idea that's in this word father. In Psalm 68 and verse 5, he said, God is a father of the fatherless and a judge, or your version may say protector, for the widows. The idea here is God protecting his people from their enemies. A father to the fatherless is one who looks out for people and protects them against the oppressive and the wicked. Same thing with the widows. So again, besides the idea of provision, there's the idea of protection that's inherent in that idea of being a father. It's more than being able to have children. Notice again in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Look again here in the book of Proverbs, and this time in chapter 3 and in verse 12. Look at chapter 3 and verse 12. In chapter 3 and verse 12, you'll see again. He says, whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father, the son in whom he delights. So here we have the idea of a father who not only teaches, but disciplines and trains and tries to mold a son. You know, there are men that have boys and girls. They're never around. They're never around to teach them. They're never around to mold their character. They don't spend any time with it. If there's any done, it's done by the mother sometimes. But I'm his daddy. Really? A father is one who provides and protects and teaches and trains and molds character. That's what's connoted in these words that we're looking at. Look at Psalm 103. Psalm 103. Here's another idea that's carried in this word father. Look in Psalm 103 verse 13. Just as a father has compassion on his children. Now some guys say, I'm a daddy, I spank them every time I can. No, there's also compassion, kindness, understanding, tenderness. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. And you'll note in case after case, the idea of a father is used to connote the very character and nature of the God that we love and serve. Look over in Malachi chapter 1 and verse 6. Malachi chapter 1 and verse 6. This is interesting. Here God is talking through the prophet Malachi to the nation of Israel. And he says, a son honors his father. Well, that's way back in Exodus chapter 20. We read that. A son honors his father. That is, he's supposed to. A son honors his father, and a servant his master. Then if I am a father, where is my honor? Was he their biological father? That's not the point. I stand in that relationship to you. I've provided for you. I've protected you. I've had compassion on you. I've tried to teach you. Where's my honor? Honor your father and mother. Now here's where this comes into play. What about a stepfather? He didn't give the seed that gave you life, but he's the one that provided for you and protected you and had compassion on you and taught you. Should you honor him? Honor your father and mother. Same thing with the mother. So this is something for parents to think about, and it's something for children to think about who may have been in an unfortunate situation where they don't have their biological father or mother, but yet they still have the duty to those who perform the responsibilities of a father and a mother. Now, what about this honor thing? What does that entail? Honor your father and mother. Does that mean you always say yes, sir, no, sir? That's probably a very good practice for parents to instill, but it's a lot more than that. Somebody says, I love my mom and daddy. I'll fight for my mom and dad. Is that what honor is? Well, if you love your mother and dad, maybe you will and should fight for them. But let's look at what the Bible teaches that honor your father and mother has to do with. Now, first of all, let me say what it does not have to do with. Honor your father and mother is not because they live a commendable life and they have a great character. If they have that, great. If you've had a mother and dad you can look up to because of their morality, their spirituality, their faithfulness, wonderful. Thank God for that. But honor your father and mother does not depend on having parents like that. Nor does it depend upon the fact of, well, I honor my mom and dad because my dad honored his dad. It's not a matter of family tradition. It's not a matter of, well, it just feels right. It would just feel wrong not to do it. No, that's not the reason you do it. You ought to do it, and hopefully you do feel good about it, but that's not the reason. Well, I honor my mother and daddy because they're my favorite people in the world. No, that's not the reason either. It's great if they're some of your favorite people in the world, but that's not the reason. Well, I know, man, I hope this is not the case. I honor my mother and father because, boy, I'm going to get an inheritance. I want to be part of the will. God help us if that's the case. Why do you honor your mother and father? If you've been here all week, I hope you know the answer. Duties are based on relationship. That's why. Whether good people, bad people, make any difference. They're your mother and your father, and God says they deserve your respect. The word honor is the idea of respect and honor. So, having put that aside, here are some practical applications of loving father and mother. Now, I don't know about these families in this audience, or you young people sitting here. It's been great to have these young people sitting in front of me from night to night. But look over at Exodus chapter 21. I want you to think about how you treat your mother and dad based on these verses. In verse 15, he said, he who strikes his father or mother, what do you do with him? Shall surely be put to death? Let me ask you something, parents. We're not talking about the family this week, but I'm going to throw in something while I'm at it. When that little 1-year-old or 2-year-old wants to slap you back when you try to discipline them, or that 4 or 5-year-old, do you just laugh and say to the kid, what if they're 18 years old and they do that? If you're under the old law, they're to be put to death. Put to death. Honor your father and mother involves never treating your parents that way. Drop down a couple verses. Look at verse 17. He who curses, that's not cusses, that's not C-U-S, curses. There's a difference. Curse is to wish something bad or evil on someone. You might say, I wish my mother and daddy were dead. That's cursing. I don't like what they told me or they prohibited me from doing. He says, he who curses his mother or his father, what? What does it say? Should he be put to death? How serious is this business of honoring your father and mother? The family is the foundation of our society. It's the first human relationship that existed upon the face of the earth. The man and the woman, and then later the boys that came from them. So here God is laying a foundation for a solid family. You see our nation falling apart, and part of the reason is the family's falling apart. Young people are not taught to honor their father and their mother. In fact, our nation is often intervening and telling them they don't have to honor their father and mother. And schools are telling them that, but God says they're to honor their father and their mother. Look over at Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 32. Back when I had children at home, I had a chair, in my living room. It was Dad's chair. If I walked in, my boys knew what to do. Get out of it. I'm not ashamed of that. Look at Leviticus 19:32. You shall rise up. Your version may say stand up. I think the ESV says stand up. You shall rise up before the gray-headed and honor the aged. So your mother and father are older than you are. What's happened to respect for age? Young people talk to their mother and daddy like they talk to their peers. Instead of yes, ma'am, and no, sir, it's language that they use of their peers at school. Teach your children to honor you in the way they talk to you. And when you talk to them, don't let them be looking off to the side when they're going to get through in their TV show and their telephone. Have them look you in the eye and respect you and listen to what you got to say. Young people, you have that responsibility. Not because I said it, not because the elders say it, not because you're a member of the church, because you're a child. You have a relationship to somebody called your mother and your father, and God said honor your mother and your father. Look over again at Proverbs chapter 30. Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 17. In Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 17, he said, the eye that mocks a father and scorns a mother, the ravens of the valley will pick it out and the young eagles will eat it. When you leave your mother and daddy, maybe they've dressed you down for something or they've given you a job to do. You go with your friends and boy, you start talking all kind of bad things about them. I don't like the way they do things, and you score. God knows. God knows. God knows those people who scorn their mother and daddy and mock their mother and daddy. Honor your father and mother. Exodus chapter 20 is more than, well, I love them. They're, we got the same name and they're my mom and daddy. It's a lot more than that. These are practical applications of what loving your father and mother means. So, look at Hebrews chapter 12. You say, preacher, you don't understand. My mother and daddy, they're good people, but they make mistakes and they're wrong sometimes. Yes, I know that. I've been a father. I am a father. Yes, any father that has any sense ought to be humble enough to realize he makes mistakes. That does not undermine the responsibility to be honored as a father. Look at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 9. He's actually talking to the Hebrews about their attitude to difficulties in their lives. But he uses the father relationship to talk about the lesson that he wants to present. Look in Hebrews chapter 12, and we're going to start here in verse 9. We have had earthly fathers, so God is allowing these people to suffer, and sometimes people don't like that, but sometimes it disciplines their character. But he says, look, think about this. We've had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, and it's that next phrase that I want you to note. He didn't say they disciplined us for a short time in the right way. That's not what it says. As seemed good to them. Isn't that interesting? They did the best they could, but it may have not been the best. But it seemed like the right thing to do. And he says, they disciplined us as seemed best to them. He disciplines us for our good. He didn't say that about God. It is good when God disciplines us. They did the best they could so that we may share his holiness. He said, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who've been trained by it afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. So your parents may not always be right. That does not exempt you from honoring them in the way you talk to them and the way you treat them. You still must honor them in spite of the fact they may come back later and say, son, I was wrong, I'm sorry. And nothing wrong with parents saying that, by the way. Just go back and admit, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. But that does not mean you ought to say, you don't have to honor me anymore. No, sir. Why? It's based on relationship, not getting everything right. It's based on the relationship. Duties are based on relationship. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Here, Timothy's a young man, probably in his mid-30s, somewhere in that area, when this letter is written to him. And he's preaching in the church at Ephesus. In the church at Ephesus, there would be people of different ages. Besides those his age, there would be older men and older women. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5. Now, I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. Your version may say, do not rebuke an elder. This is not elders, bishops, like you have 5 of them here. This is not this. This is older people. And he's telling Timothy, a younger man. Now, if you're 18, you might say 30s is an older man. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about this, and it would apply to that. But he's talking to Timothy, even in his 30s. He said, do not, now this version, and I think it does a good job, say sharply rebuke. You can go look up the word. That's the idea. Do not sharply rebuke an older man. Well, how am I to talk to him, Paul? He tells him, listen to this, but rather appeal to him as a father. Now, if you didn't know what honor father and mother meant, that wouldn't mean a thing in the world to you. If people treated their fathers with disrespect and dishonor like in our society, that would not mean a thing. It's understood, it's expected you would understand that you don't talk to your daddy like you talk to your brother, like you talk to your schoolmate. Your daddy may be wrong, but he's still your daddy. He's still your father. He's still the one that provided for you and protects you and shows you compassion and tries to mold your character. You respect him when you talk to him. And he tells Timothy, when you talk to older men, you talk to them like that. They may need rebuke. They may be wrong. But you talk to them different than you do one of your own peers that's in their 30s. That's the idea. So he says, older men as fathers, younger women as sisters in all purity. And then to the women, verse 2, as mothers. Again, you see the idea of there's a way you treat your mother that's different maybe than the way you treat your sister, your tone of voice and how you handle things. All growing out of this idea of honoring your mother and father. But the very fact that they need rebuke says what? They've done something that needs to be corrected. They've made a mistake. So honor father and mother does not mean they're perfect and do not make mistakes. They do. And fathers and mothers, while they should apologize for their mistake, they should not undermine God's plan. You're still expected to respect me. And when you talk to me and you differ with me, you're going to do it in a respectful manner, and there ought to be an or else. But that's God's plan, not mine. That's not Church of Christ doctrine. That's been there from the beginning of man's existence on the earth and having a family relationship. Duties are based on relationship. All right, those are some of the things that's involved in the word honor, but there's a couple more I want to bring to your attention. Here in Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul uses that command that you find way back in the book of Exodus, he expands the application. Look at it in Ephesians chapter 6. Verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord. It may well be he's talking to children who are old enough to be Christians because he says in connection with the Lord. And so I don't know how old they were that Paul had in mind, 14, 16, 18, I don't know. But he says, children, obey your parents. But what's the next verse? What does he base that on? The very thing we began with tonight. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. Honor your father and mother involved not only respecting them in your tone of voice and the way you speak to them, etc., but it involved doing what they say. You may not agree, you may not like it, but you obey your parents. Why? Because they're always right? No. Because they're Christians? No. Now, being in the Lord makes it more emphatic. You obey them because they're your mother and your father. Duties are based on relationship. Now, which mother and father are they to obey? That's pretty clear, isn't it? The one you sustain a relationship to as a son or a daughter. Now, look over at the book of Esther in chapter 2. We get into some matters now that are just not quite as easy for us. So, what happens as people get older? So let's go to Esther chapter 2. Over in Esther chapter 2 and verse 20, this obeying father and mother. What if I'm 30 years old? Now do I just do whatever dad says? Or if I'm 50 years old, I'm still my father. But look at Esther chapter 2 verse 20. So here's the story about Esther. You remember about Esther, the virgin who the king took for a wife. And verse 20, there was Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. Mordecai, you remember, a relative had brought her up. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. So here's Mordecai, and he had brought her up. It wasn't her immediate father, but he had brought her up and cared for her and provided for her and protected her and taught her. And now he says she used to do what he said just as she did when under his care. But now she's older. She's a queen. Well, you remember there was a plan by Haman to destroy all the Jews, and Mordecai found out about it. And so he goes to Esther. Look over again in the book of Esther, and this time in chapter 4 and verse 8. And he's encouraging Esther to go to the king about this plot against the Jewish people. Verse 8, he gave him, that is, those who took care of these women who were the king's women, a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her, now listen to this, and to order her to go into the king to implore his favor and plead with him for her people. So here's a letter. Mordecai says, you tell Esther I'm telling her to go to the king about this order. Now, when she was a young girl, under his care, she did what he said. Now he's telling her to do something. but she doesn't do it because he told her. As people get older, relationships change. Look again here at the book of Esther, this time in verse 14. So, Esther was hesitant to do that because if you recall, if you went before the king without being invited, you could be put to death. But in verse 14, Mordecai said this to her: if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows? We talk about divine providence. No greater book in the Bible on divine providence than Esther. Certainly in the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph, etc. But here he says, who knows? He says, who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? And so Esther put her life on the line and went to the king. But not because of the original order of Mordecai, but rather she went to the king by virtue of her providential position. She was in a position by the providence of God to help avert this destruction of the Jews. And so she put her life on the line and went to the king, and of course the destruction of the Jews was avoided. So you can see a change from the time she was young and under his care to where she's older now in a different position in life. You can see that clearly. Look over in Proverbs chapter 13. Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 24. These verses will help highlight the idea of this change that takes place as people get older. In chapter 13, verse 24, it says, he who withholds his rod hates his son. He who loves him disciplines him diligently. So, we've got a lot of young people here that are young enough to fit that category real well. Be disciplined with the rod, whatever that your father decides that may be. But be that as it may, what happens when you're 30 years old? Does that change? Yeah, it's a little different then. Age changes the relationship somewhat. No one would read this verse and think that a 60-year-old man is to treat his 30-year-old son like this verse talks about. You can see that the relationship changes, therefore the duty changes. Look again in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 13 and 14. 23, 13, and 14. Now, a 60-year-old man may feel like doing that with his 30-year-old son sometime because they're so independable and ungodly, but it's talking about a time when the father has that opportunity and control in his relationship. In Proverbs chapter 23, verse 13, do not withhold discipline from the child. Now here, whatever this discipline is, listen to this. Although you strike him with the rod, he will not die. He thinks, boy, this is it. This is judgment day. Whatever this discipline is, it's not going, sit over there in the corner and time out. It's not that. Something a whole lot worse than that. He said, he's not going to die. He may think he's going to die. He's not going to die. He will not die. But you strike him with the rod, he'll rescue his soul from Sheol. That says something about parental discipline as it's viewed in the Bible, not in our modern textbooks. But note, what about when he's 30? You do the same thing? What about if he's 50 and you're 80? So, well, he's older now. It's different. Yeah, it's different. The relationship's different. And that affects the duty, as you can readily see. Look at Deuteronomy 21. Over in Deuteronomy 21, I want to hold your finger there. You probably already got it. But I'm going to use this opportunity to slip something in that's not in this lesson, but I missed it the other night. Brooke brought it to my attention. It was on my notes, and I missed it. I want to say something about it. Look at Proverbs chapter 13. You know, we talked about withdrawing the other night. And they say, well, that's my blood, that's my son, that's my daughter. I can't do that. Look at Proverbs 13. He talks about idolatry entering into their midst. And so he said, now look at verse 6. If your brother, your mother's son or your daughter, or the wife you perish, or your friend who is as your own soul, entice you secretly, let us go and serve other gods. Note verse 8. You shall not yield to him or listen to him. Your eye shall not pity him. You shall not spare or conceal him. You shall surely kill him. What? Make a difference who it is. They invite you to turn away from God, serve idols. That was the punishment. But it's my flesh and blood. Too bad. God comes first. Remember the greatest commandment? What's the greatest commandment? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That takes precedent over every other responsibility. We'll go over to chapter 21. That's where I wanted to take us tonight. Verse 18. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elder of the city at the gateway of his hometown. And they shall say to the elder of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard. And all the men of his city will stone him to death. Can you imagine an 80-year-old man getting his 50-year-old son, dragging him to the elder of the city, saying, this boy won't listen to me, he's drinking. No. Duties are based on relationships, but relationships change sometimes with age. This is a boy that this man still has under his discipline, under his control, and this boy won't listen. I don't know if Israel ever did this, by the way. I don't know of any record of it, but it was God's plan. Why? Because God was heartless? No. You ever heard of the judge that hanged horse thieves? You probably heard of that story. And this horse thief said, you mean you're going to hang me for stealing a horse? He said, no. I'm hanging you to keep 1,000 other people from stealing horses. God loves all those boys and girls. And he wanted a lesson to come through to them with this solemn punishment. But remember, it's someone that's under the parent's control. After the child leaves home, he gets of age, much of that control is lost. Maybe some influence of respect, maybe even not that. But be that as it may, duties change with age. All right, there's another thing that enters into our consideration. As your child gets older, or as you get older, you enter new relationships. You're born into this world, you got the father relationship, the mother-child relationship. But when you get older, you're going to have some new relationships, and these new relationships have duties that grow out of them. For example, you get married. So here's your little girl. She's to obey her mother and father. She gets married. What does Ephesians 5:22 say as a duty of her relationship to that man? Subject herself to that man. Obey her husband. But what about daddy? Oh, she got a new relationship. So daddy says, but husband says, who's she to listen to? With new relationships come new responsibilities. Same thing with the man. He gets married, he loves his mom and dad, but now, husbands love your wives. And men make a mistake if they don't make their wives understand, I love my mother and daddy, but I love you more. And she ought to feel like the queen of his heart in life and take first place outside of God. So husbands, love your wife. There's that new relationship. Same thing with the idea of the father-child. The father rules the child. We read that a while ago in Ephesians chapter 6. But what happens when that boy that was obeying his father now becomes a father, enters a new relationship? He's got a boy. Grandpa says, Daddy says, who's the boy to listen to? So the daddy now is a father himself and not subject to listen to everything Grandpa says. He's got to make the decisions for his own family. As he got older, he entered a new relationship with new duties. Same thing with the mother of the household. When there was a little girl, she did what her daddy said. She's got a household. 1 Timothy 5:14 says women are to rule the household. Your version may say keep the house. It's not sweep the floors and do the dishes. It's rule the household. Now she's got a job. Not just to do what Mama said and Daddy said. She's got to make decisions what's best for her family because she's entered a new relationship. Same thing with employer-employee. So your child grows older. They get a job, hopefully. They better. And you ought to expect them to get a job and be supported. But they support themselves. And so they go out and they go to work. They've got an employer. So the employer says, you're going to work till 5 o'clock. Mom and Daddy said, no, I want you home at 3 o'clock. What are they going to do? They've got a new relationship to an employer. That's got to enter the picture. And so it may seem complicated, but if you just keep in mind what we've been stressing all week, Duties are based on relationships. I think it'll help, at least it helps me, to work through these seeming difficulties. I want to note, as my time is quickly running out, look at Mark chapter 7. What else is entailed in this? Mark chapter 7, and I'll just briefly mention this because I doubt it's of any question to this audience. And Mark chapter 7, Jesus indicted the rulers of those people for failing to honor their mother and father. We started out with that, honor your mother and father. We saw it involves obey. Honor involves respect, and then it involves obey, but it involves something else. It involves providing for them if they're in need. Over in Mark chapter 7, verse 9 through 12, I'm not going to read the whole thing. He says, you set God's command aside to keep your tradition. Now note verse 10. For Moses says, honor your father and your mother. But you say, verse 11, if a man says to his father and mother, whatever I have that would help you is carbon, that is to say, given to God, he no longer has to honor his mother and father. Oh, I'm going to put it in the treasury over here. I don't have to take care of mom and dad. Jesus said, that's not what the Bible teaches. Honor your father and mother says you take care of their needs when they're in need. That's involved in honor. But I got a family to support. Yeah, you have a family. And part of that family is your mother and father. And it's your job to take care of them. Look over at 1 Timothy chapter 5. Well, you don't have to. I just talked about it a while ago. If a man does not provide for his own, what does it say? He's worse than an infidel. And in that particular chapter, he talks about your grandparents, not only your mother and father, but your grandparents. So honor father and mother is not just a matter of saying yes, ma'am, when you meet them at the door, but seeing about their needs. Fortunately, in our society, that's much less of a problem because people have pension plans, they have retirement, they have Social Security, they have all of these other things. In their society, many of these things were not in place. And so you had to take care of your mother and dad. We still had that obligation if that situation arises. Let me quickly here talk about this honor and obey and provide responsibility and how it affects the changing years. So now, and you're not 16-year-old at home, you're 56 years old. And your parents are maybe 76 years old or 80 years old. Now what? Does honor father and mother mean that you have to hang out with them? You know, they may say, you need to come over here and just spend time and us talk. Well, that's a privilege, but that's not a duty of the relationship. Now, if they need something, yes. But sometimes parents will strive to put a pressure on children along that line. What's the duty? Not what mom and daddy like. What's the duty of the relationship? Not to hang out and watch TV together and play card games together. That's fine if you can and you like to do that. What about indulging every whim that they have? Well, I want to do this and I want to do that. If you're a good son, you'll do that for it. Well, not necessarily. That's not a duty of the relationship. That may be a privilege, something you like to do. Now, if they can't pay for their groceries, they can't pay for their rent, they need help with their doctor, but yes, that's another thing. What about acting like they're perfect? What are you doing telling me I'm wrong? I'm your mother and daddy. That's not something that the father-mother relationship forbids. In fact, what you ought to do is reprove them respectfully. 1 Timothy chapter 5. What about trying to change them? You see your mother and dad, you know, they're going off on a course that you'd have never dreamed that it went on, the things they embrace, the doctrines they believe, the way they live, maybe morally, maybe spiritually, maybe the church they go to. What do you do about that? Can you change them? You may try. Do you ever give up? Maybe. Look over at Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Jesus was preaching what we call the Sermon on the Mount, and there was a large audience, but you read the first few verses of the sermon, you'll see he was talking to his disciples. And part of it was about their work and their mission, and you see that in the Beatitudes when he talks about people that are going to persecute you and say things against you falsely for my name's sake, when they went out and taught the Word of God. I want you to notice Matthew chapter 7, here in verse 6. He said, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, for they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. If I understand, which I may not, but if I understand what he's telling his disciples is, there's some people, truth means nothing to them. Don't waste your time. Boy, you hate to think that about your mother and daddy, but that may be the case. You can't force truth down somebody's throat. And if they're not interested in truth, you're not doing anything ungodly to say, I gave them the opportunity, they don't want it, they're not interested in truth, I'm turning somewhere else. That's exactly what the apostles did. Over in Matthew chapter 10, in fact, in verse 12, when Jesus was telling the apostles about the mission that they would be sent on, he said in verse 12, as you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the house is worthy, give it your blessing of peace. But if it's not worthy, take back your blessing of peace. Whoever does not receive you nor heed your words, as you go out of that house or city, shake the dust off your feet. What if it's a relative? They won't be receptive to truth. Nothing you can do. That's what Jesus did, God did with Israel. That's what Jesus did with people who refused to accept the truth. Down in verse 35 through 39, he went on to point out, as you go out and teach this message, he said, verse 35, I came to set a man against his father, and a mother against her daughter, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his household. He who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. You're going to go teach this gospel. One of the parents are going to obey the gospel, the other is not. Maybe the daddy will obey the gospel, the children won't. You've got to put God first. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about these divisions in families. Don't let night, let it keep you awake. If there's anything that bothers me sometimes at night, it's your family. But read these verses. Duty is based on relationship, but let's not confuse the duties that are involved in that. Sometimes parents want the feelings of love. There's the word love. I could preach another sermon on love right now, but I don't think you'd love me for it. But anyway, there's a love the Bible talks about that has nothing to do with feelings. You care about somebody. Love your enemy, for example. There's a love that has to do with the husband-wife relationship or the intimate relationship between them. But there's another word, love, same word, but it's used in another way, and that is to talk about affection, feelings, intimate type stuff like that, like friendship love. And your parents may want you to feel love. But they drink, and they curse, and they gamble, they throw away their money, do all things, and you feel love? No, you don't have to feel love. That's not a duty, the obligation of the relationship. Now, you are to have the kind of love that cares for them, in spite of what they are. If they need, care for them. The Samaritan took care of the guy that got robbed. He didn't know anything about his family, his past, what kind of life he lived. He just needed help. Jesus said, love your neighbor. And the same thing's true with your parents. You love your parents regardless of who they are. What about forgiving them? Why don't you forgive me? Well, are you repentant? Well, I'm your mother and daddy. If you're not repentant, you do not have the obligation to forgive somebody. You have people on television tell you ought to just forgive somebody. Somebody shot your kid, you ought to just forgive them. No, sir, I'm not going to forgive them. Not if they're not penitent. God won't. And he told Jeremiah, don't even pray for these people. That's some doctrine brought up in the doctrines of men. If they're not repentant, you don't have to forgive them. That, again, doesn't mean you treat them badly. You still got to take care of them, still honor your father and mother, but you don't forgive people, not required to, who are impenitent. God didn't. So, regardless, look, turn with me to 2 Chronicles. Turn with me to 2 Chronicles. And look at 2 Chronicles chapter 34. Josiah, verse 1, was 8 years old when he became king. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. He did right in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father David, did not turn aside to the right or to the left. And in the 8th year of his reign, how old are you young men on these pews over here? 8, became a king, 8 years later, 16 years old. He knew who he wanted to serve. In the 8th year of his reign, while he's still a youth, he began to seek the God of his father David. And in the 12th year, now how old is he? 20 years old. He began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places. He said, boy, he must have had a great daddy and granddaddy. No, he had a sorry daddy and granddaddy. Go back and read about it. Ammon was an idolater. His granddaddy was so wicked, he'd burned kids in the fire into their idols. And I'm saying all of that to say, if you got a sorry dad and a sorry granddad or a sorry mother and a sorry grandmother, that's no excuse for you not making the right choices. We're not going to get to the day of judgment and be able to say, well, Mom and Daddy. God's not going to accept that. You have a duty to God that supersedes every other relationship. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Jesus said this is the first commandment. When Mark recorded it, he said this is the greatest commandment of all. This is it. To love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. When Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said this, and this is a little statement that can cover every action you do. You say, I don't know if I ought to do this. Well, remember what Paul said. 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whatever you do in word or deed, do all to the glory of God. Before you say something, before you do something, before you go to that place, will it glorify God? That can be the principle you live by. Help us to please God while on this earth and fulfill the highest relationship we have. And that is to our Creator and to His beloved Son, who died to save us and who will judge us in the last day, and to the Holy Spirit, who came in His love to reveal to us the way of life and peace. We're going to bring this lesson and this meeting to a close. But it doesn't have to be the close of your consideration of your life and your relationship to God. If you just want to get better and you need help, you got some great people here who could help you do that. If you need even now to seek the prayers of brethren in your behalf or to turn your life around and become a Christian, you can do that even tonight. If you need somebody to help you with that, when the song is being sung, walk up here to the front, or afterwards talk to one of these men. They'll be glad to help you. So let us take our songbooks or look up at the slide and sing this song of praise as we think about the God who loved us and sent His Son